Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second half of our time together in this summer course. In the first 4 weeks of our summer course, we really did a deep dive into the concepts of assessment and counseling, focusing primarily on the content that you need to know for when you take your licensing exam to become an LPC. In the second half of the semester, what we're going to do is we're going to shift gears and we're really going to focus on how to apply these skills. What assessment and counseling actually looks like on a daily when you are engaging in assessment in the work that you do as a clinician. So, to get started, I just wanted to orient us a little bit to sort of the framework that we're going to use for the rest of this semester or the rest of our course. So, throughout weeks 5 through 8, we're going to be learning and observing how to conduct a substance use assessment while also having a considerable focus on how to write an assessment report. And we will start each week by presenting the general information on the topic for that week, and we will follow that with a discussion of the assignment that is due that week. So this week, the topic will be corresponding to the section of the assessment report that we're going to focus on, because each week we're going to focus on a different section of the assessment report. So for this week, we're going to be focusing on the background information. In week 6, we're going to focus on the assessment results. And in week 7, we're going to talk about the functional impact and referral section of an assessment report. So again, each week we'll start the lecture with talking about what these sections mean, how to actually conduct them, and then we'll end the lecture with the application, which is writing drafts of these sections of the assessment report. In week 8, we will talk about the feedback sessions and what those look like, but also during week 8, you will submit a final integrated assessment report. And what this integrated assessment report is going to be is each of the following drafts that you have submitted updated with feedback that we've given you after you've submitted. So at the end of week 5, 6, and 7, you will submit drafts of those sections of the assessment report. We will read them, give you detailed feedback, and then it is your responsibility to implement that feedback for the final integrated report. And we'll talk a little bit more about this at the end of this lecture just because we will be talking about the assignment by that point. But as I've already mentioned, the topic for this week is the background information while also focusing on general assessment writing skills, which is all gathered through the intake interview. So to get started, let's talk a little bit about the assessment report writing process and what the intake interview looks like in real life. So to start out, I want to go into a little bit of detail on things they won't tell you in our textbook, things that you really have to hear from someone who does assessments on a regular basis or who is engaging in these assessments as a training clinician, like they're the person teaching. So for starters, typically only individuals with PsyDs and PhDs receive training on how assessments should be conducted. Much less do other individuals receive training on how to write assessment reports. And what that means is that a lot of clinicians feel like they are not necessarily prepared to do assessments, which is pretty normal, though unfortunate. And most clients who come in asking for an assessment or who are needing an assessment don't always know where to go to get their assessment. In fact, some research says that most people will go to their doctors or psychiatrists first and ask about assessments before they come to therapists or even psychologists because they just don't know who they need to go to for the assessment. Also, writing assessment reports takes longer than you might expect. In fact, it's estimated that you are going to spend quite a bit of time writing the assessment. And for every hour that you spend face to face with a client doing the assessment, collecting data, and actually talking to them, you will estimate having about 2 to 3 hours of non-face-to-face time that you'll spend prepping, scoring, or writing the report in the hour. And that's what you will put in your hours tracker for your license. So for every hour of direct contact, you're going to have about 2 to 3 hours of non-face-to-face contact. And honestly, assessment reports take longer than you might expect in the sense that typical turnaround on an assessment report is 2 weeks after the last date of the assessment or data collection. So, from the time that you have the client fill out the very last assessment, you will have 2 weeks to finalize the assessment report, to go over it, and then submit it to the client. You should never have a client wait longer than 1 month for their assessment reports because that's just excessive, and it's going to slow you down because as an assessor and as a clinician, you're going to be doing multiple assessments at a time. And if you are doing multiple writing, like you're writing multiple assessment reports at the same time that you're also collecting data from new clients, it's going to get easily confusing because the clients might start to blend in terms of whose information corresponds with who. And always, assessment writing is really unlike anything else. It's an entire different breed. Like, when you are in school, they always talk about how research writing is not creative writing. And when we talk about assessments, assessment writing is not creative writing, but it's also not research writing. The closest probably equivalent that you have is that assessment writing is a little bit like writing therapy notes, depending on the agency that you work for. So let's go into a little bit more detail about what assessment writing is. So in general, each agency will have its own format or template for report writing, and you will likely use whatever template they recommend. If you're working independently, you will create your own assessment template. But even with that template being a little bit sort of agency specific, there are some consistencies. One of the primary general consistencies is that you are going to use the assessment report to tell a story that answers the question of what is going on for the client. So you need to make sure that the entire report tells the story that answers what's going on for your client, and that you don't stop asking questions until you find the answer to the client's questions. So the entire format of the assessment report is really all about answering that question. But you also have to ask yourself who you're writing the assessment report for. Most often, especially if you are writing a report for an adult, the report is for the client. And you may need to keep in mind that because the client is not a clinician, maybe they're not someone who has any background in psychology or even in substance use counseling, one of the primary things that you need to do in making the report accessible to them is minimize any jargon that you use. So take out any language that the client won't understand, any acronyms that have not been previously defined, because this report is for the client and it needs to be accessible to them. But you also have to keep the secondary audience in mind. So a secondary audience for an assessment might be other providers who could be looking at the assessment report. If you're doing an assessment for the court system because someone has been mandated to get a substance use assessment, you might need to keep in mind that the secondary audience could be the court system. And you have to keep that in mind while you're writing the report, and also altering the report in ways that make sense to account for that secondary audience. And always, it is vital to put the assessment report in a format that makes sense for the client, because this is also a medical document. So make sure that the client understands that this document is a medical report that will go in their medical file that they can then share with other doctors, and you need to make sure that you explicitly convey that information to the client so that they know what to do with the assessment report. And also, in that general assessment report writing theme, the entire report should be written in past tense. So an example of this might be sometimes as like general people will use the terms like currently or presently to describe what's going on. But because an assessment report can be read at any time, the way that you specify that is by saying at the time of this report. So instead of saying something like currently or presently, you replace that with at the time of this report. You also need to make sure that the entire report is written in the third person. So If you're referencing yourself as the clinician and as the assessor, you call yourself the assessor. Instead of saying I or me, you'll say the assessor found this, or the client shared this with the assessor. This gives the report more of that medical feel, and it also makes the report much more accessible to everyone who's reading it, because not everyone's going to recognize that when you say I or me, that you mean you as the assessor and not the client. So always write the report in the third person. And you need to follow kind of a general format with your writing, in the sense that you're going to put one main idea per paragraph and one idea per sentence. So each paragraph of an assessment report covers one main topic. So a good example of this is when you're writing the substance use history section. Each paragraph is a different substance, and you spend that paragraph talking about only that substance. But then even within each sentence, that sentence only has one idea. So that means that you are only going to use the word "and" when you are delineating a list of items, and that overall, this sort of framework in an assessment report will make the entire report seem a little bit choppy when you're writing. This is the general format for an assessment report because it makes it easier for the secondary audiences who will be reading the report to look for the information that's important. So again, eliminate "and" unless you are referencing a list of information, and keep your writing to one main idea per paragraph and one idea per sentence. And then always remember that you need to put your assessment report on agency letterhead so that you can clearly delineate in that letterhead the contact information for your agency, up-to-date contact information, so that your client knows who to reach out to should they have questions. And that also, again, reiterates the sort of not intensity, but how important this information is when this gets out to secondary audiences. Like, this was an important assessment for this client, and that's why it was conducted. So once you get sort of these general frameworks of writing an assessment report, the next thing is the actual structure of the assessment report. So the first section of an assessment report after the letterhead is what we call the demographic information. And the demographic information is typically a small little table at the very top after the letterhead on your document that just gives the identifying information for the client. You're going to have their client's name. Also, if they have any nicknames that you will be using in the report, you would put that in parentheses after their name, their date of birth, what that corresponds to in terms of their chronological age at the time of the assessment report, and then you can see the rest of this information: race, ethnicity, their primary language, handedness, their grade in school, the date of the evaluation, the date that you gave them the report, and the name of you as the assessor. If you are under supervision, there will also be a line under evaluator that says supervisor, and you'll list your supervisor as well. After the demographic information, the next section of the report is the reason for the client's referral. So this is a paragraph that states why the client is coming into the assessment that you have written in your own words. So some important content that you're going to include in the reason for referral paragraph is who is coming in for the assessment. Were they self-referred? Were they other referred? And why are they seeking an assessment now? Why do they need that referral? And this question that we're trying to answer throughout the report, this reason for the referral is the question that we're trying to answer throughout the entirety of the report. And the end summary that you will put at the end of your assessment report will answer these questions in a concise manner. So keep in mind that you're going to present the question in this reason for referral section. You're going to present the client's question of why they're coming in for an assessment report. And you can spend the report going into more detail and going beyond this question, but answering the question that you put in this paragraph is the bare minimum that you need to answer in your assessment report. And also, keep in mind that sometimes the content and the reason for referral is going to be sensitive to the client. So, if you have a client who's coming in because they're mandated to receive a substance use assessment, it might be a good idea to talk to them about how they want that information to be displayed. Making it clear to them that you are still going to include that information because it is important and it is required for their reason for referral, but that you want them to have a little bit of a say in how that information is going to be displayed. So you can see here an example of what that looks like. The reason for referral paragraph tends to be pretty short. This is a pretty standard length. And this sets up the framework for the next few sections of the assessment report. So the next section of the assessment report that we are going to talk about is the last one that we'll talk about during week 5, because we'll talk about the other sections of the assessment report in the corresponding weeks. So in week 6 and 7. So the next section of the assessment report is what we call the relevant history section. And this particular section of your assessment report is the longest section because this is where you are going into all of the background historical information about your client that is going to frame what is going on for them, what has led up to their presenting concerns, and why they are seeking an assessment at this point. It's giving you all of the background information to be able to interpret the report. And typically, the information that you get for the relevant history section comes from the clinical interview. And that clinical interview can be with the client explicitly, but if you're working with someone who's even an adolescent or a young adult, you may also have information from their parents or other relevant sources of information like a spouse, and that information might come into the relevant history section as well. So the assessment report relevant history section can include the following sections, but know that there is a little bit of leeway and that not all of these sections will apply to every client. And depending on your agency, they might say, oh, if your client doesn't have any legal history, we're just going to omit that section. Where other agencies might say that they have no notable medical history or legal history. So you'll just have to follow your agency's specific guidelines around what that looks like. But typically, the first section of the relevant history is the demographic information. And this is a paragraph that states who the client is, what their identities are, including their race, their ethnicity, sometimes their sexual orientation, as well as where they're currently living and what their relationship status is. And oftentimes in assessments, in this demographic information, you're also going to be putting information about the client's appearance, which can sometimes feel weird because you have to describe the client honestly. So if they come into session and they look like they haven't been taking care of themselves, they look like they're dirty, or that they are potentially significantly overweight, you note this information in the demographic information section because it is relevant to the interpretation of the report. And it's a good thing for you to just report the news. Call things as they are, but also let the client know that this is part of the assessment. And also, a good rule of thumb in this section is to double check sensitive information with the client. So for many clients, things like their sexual orientation, their race, gender, sex assigned at birth can be considered sensitive information. So you want to check with them on how they want that information to be conveyed. So a good example of this that I've run into with quite a few of my clients is for individuals who are transgender. I always ask them how they want their gender listed and if it's important for their sex assigned at birth to be specified in that section, or if it's more important to have it listed in another section of the assessment report. So similar to the reason for referral section, always clarifying to the client that this information likely needs to be in the report, but you want the client to have a say in how that information is displayed. So after you have the demographic information, the first section that follows the demographic information is typically the main focus of the assessment. Because for this class, we're focusing on how to conduct a substance use assessment, the next section is the substance use history section. And this section needs to cover a full background of all substances that a client has used in their history, including over-the-counter substances like caffeine. And you need to include in each section the age of onset for the client, client's frequency of use, any consequences of their use, as well as any attempts to cut back. And as I've already mentioned, each substance will be its own paragraph within this section. And you'll see that in an example assessment report that you're going to have access to, that at the end of each paragraph within the substance use history section, there is a little sentence that specifies whether or not the client meets criteria for a substance use disorder diagnosis for that substance. When you're initially writing your assessment report, you might not know that information. Sometimes it will be obvious that the client does not meet criteria for a substance use diagnosis, and you can specify that. But sometimes during the intake interview, you will find out that you need to dig further into whether or not someone meets criteria for a diagnosis for that substance. So you'll almost put like a little asterisk to just let yourself know, okay, we're assessing for this. I'm going to circle back and put that information in after we've collected data. A common next section is the medical history section, which is reported in the assessment report as it is reported to us by the client. So in other words, we can only say that the client reported something to us if we didn't see their medical record. So if the client says that they've been diagnosed with medical diagnoses, like they have a diagnosis for IBS or for any medical conditions in any way, we are going to say that the client reports these diagnoses unless you have actually seen the medical report. Also, some other things to keep in mind with the medical history. This section typically is going to include a history of any injuries, surgeries, or notable diagnoses for the client. And the general theme of this section is to determine if there's a medical cause for the client's presenting behaviors. But it's also important for you in this section to ascertain information on the client's current medical conditions or their medications. So list any medications that the client is taking, the classification of that medication, when they're taking it, so the frequency and dose, and why they are taking it. It's also important for many clients to ask if there are any consequences of their medications, as that information can be helpful for this report. And then oftentimes a subsection of the medical history is a section on the client's mental health history, which includes any therapy history as well as any psychotropic medications. So make sure that you're adding in how therapy has gone, how long they've been in treatment, what they were in treatment for, and any medications that they have been on. You'll also include any previous assessments and the results or conclusions of those assessments if necessary. But always make sure in this medical section, especially in the mental health subsection, that you include the risk assessment information. So whether or not the client has a history of self-harm, suicide, or homicide, that information must be in this section. We also have the developmental history section, which lists the things that seem important or unimportant for the client's presenting concerns. So typically we talk about how the client was born, if they were born vaginally or via cesarean section, if they were on time or if they were early or if they were a little bit late, and any complications with their developmental milestones. So typically in the developmental history, if there is no notable developmental history, the section says that this client met their developmental milestones, quote, within normal limits, end quote, which is what we would expect. That's what we want to see. But you always need to mark when someone misses their developmental milestones, because this could indicate a delay of some sort that might be notable for interpreting the client's report. You also want to note any reversals of developmental milestones. So noting when there's a change, but again, depending on the client, this could look different depending on if they even need this information in their report. And also a good rule of thumb, because I know that I've always asked this question of when you talk about someone in terms of months or when you talk of their age in terms of years. And the rule of thumb is that before the age of 3, you speak of someone in terms of months, but after the age of 3, you measure things in half years. So if someone had a history or a developmental milestone that was missed at 2 years old, you'd say at 48 months. But if they had a reversal at 5 years, you would say 5 years. So just to give a little bit of a framework there. We also have the psychosocial history, which is going to cover who lives with the client and is around them consistently. It may also be important in this section to get multiple sources of information, so talking with the other important people in the client's life, especially if you believe that the client's insight could be limited, especially around their substance use. And within this psychosocial history section, you're going to include a history of trauma. And depending on your agency, you may also include within this section the family history. And honestly, depending on the age of your client, the family history section can go out as far as you need it to go, depending on the client. You really get to tailor that section of the report to what's necessary for this person. You're also going to include a section on the educational history where you're going to identify the highest level of education received by your client, any majors or minors that they had in college if applicable, how well they did in school, what thoughts they had about school, and any accommodations the individual received while in school and how they reacted to having those accommodations. That's just going to be helpful information regarding potentially how this client could do in mandated treatment if necessary. And you're also going to include a section on the occupational history where you're going to discuss the client's current and past work experiences, including how they felt about their jobs, any times they were fired, including why they were fired, and explaining any significant gaps in employment for the client. And finally, you're going to include a legal history section, which will be particularly important for substance use assessments that are required by the courts. Approach this section as what I call reporting the news and not adding any subjective interpretations of your own to this section of the report. Unless it is reported by the client, if a client has a subjective interpretation, that might be notable information that you include in the report. And the best way to do that is to include it in quotes or to say that the client reported. So an example might be if the client has really strong opinions about why they were pulled over for something, you might include a quote about that in this legal history section. So as I already mentioned, a lot of the information, if not all of the information that you have for this relevant history section of an assessment report is gathered through the intake interview. So let's talk a little bit more about the intake interview. So typically an intake interview is going to be specific by agency. So a lot of agencies will have a template that you can follow or some list of questions that they want you to include for your assessment intake interview, and you just sort of follow along with that. But you can typically adapt the questions to meet the needs of the client as well as the purpose of their assessment. So if you have a client who is coming in for a substance use assessment, you can eliminate some of the questions in the template that might be asking about developmental history or even cognitive functioning if it's not relevant to the client. So there is a little bit of flexibility depending on the agency that you work for. But also you want to make sure that you recognize that building rapport with an assessment client is different than building rapport with therapy clients. So typically in traditional therapy settings, when you're building rapport with a client, you go a little bit slower. You are going to really make sure that the client feels safe with you, feels comfortable with sharing a lot of information with you, and that you are reflecting information back to them and paraphrasing information. In an assessment intake interview, that rapport looks different because you go into the interview by telling the client very explicitly that the purpose of this assessment is for you to get to know the client as much as possible and as quickly as possible so that you can help the client moving forward. That means that your assessment report tends to be more purpose-centered. You are going to go into the interview saying yeah, I'm going to be asking you a lot of questions, and there are some times where, because we have so many questions to cover, I just want you to give me simple answers and I'll tell you if you need to elaborate, because you don't need all of this background information to build a solid warm relationship with your client. In general, assessments compared to therapy feel a little bit more cold, but also keep in mind that your client is sharing some important information with you and they still need to see you as a warm individual in comparison to general population people. Also, within the intake interview, keep in mind that there are some absolute requirements that you must cover in your intake interview. One of those is that you absolutely have to talk with your client about informed consent, confidentiality and the limits of confidentiality, mandated reporting, and a disclosure of your supervisor, and if your sessions are video recorded, if applicable to your agency. So, for informed consent, you need to make sure that the client is still comfortable moving forward with the assessment and that they consent to all aspects of the assessment report. You need to make sure that you talk about confidentiality, define that for the client in a way that makes sense to them, and disclosing the limits of confidentiality and how that relates to mandated reporting of information. Because you want the client to know that that information is important to know for them, but also could come up in your assessment reporting. And then again, if you have a supervisor or if your agency uses video recording software, to make sure that you disclose that information to the client. You also must cover the purpose and structure of the assessment. So make sure that you are covering with the client why they're coming in. What question are they needing asked? Because that is going to frame the entire assessment that you're doing. You need to know what question you're trying to answer with your assessment report. But also you need to cover the structure of the assessment. Talk to the client about what the assessment will be used for, how this will look, what timelines will look like so that they can make informed decisions moving forward. And you always need to do an assessment of self-harm, suicide, homicide, and history of abuse with your client. Make sure that you are not only conducting these assessments and asking if someone has an experience with self-harm, suicide, or homicide, but also documenting that information in your notes and or your assessment report depending on your agency. And because we are focusing on substance use assessments, it's pretty imperative that we have a substance use history as an absolute requirement in the intake interview. Again, if you're doing an assessment for another agency and it's not more of this substance use focus, then this section might not necessarily be a requirement for day one of the intake interview, but for the purposes of our work together, it is a requirement. And typically the intake interview will take between 1 and 2 hours, depending on the client, how much information will be required for the secondary audience of the report that you're writing. So different clients are more talkative than others, so you might have to talk with them about what information you need, and that can lengthen the report. But also, if this report is a high stakes assessment, so it's being used to determine something like child custody, you may have a longer intake interview because it is more important to get as much information as possible. And because some clients are more talkative than others, you may have to get really comfortable with interrupting the client and talking about how you need to move into the next section because you are trying to maximize the client's time and not spend too much time on information that's not going to be relevant for the assessment report. You also want to make sure that you take some time during the intake interview to orient the client to the assessment process following the intake interview. So telling them like, okay, now that we've done the intake interview, I'm going to be sending you an email with some links for assessments that you need to complete on your own at home. These assessments will typically take around 2 hours to complete them in total, but you can take breaks and pause as much as you needed as long as you complete them by this date. And you also want to give the client timelines for the feedback session. So say, I need you to complete your assessments by Friday of this week so that we can schedule our feedback session. Our feedback session is typically about an hour, and we can do that either virtually or in person. And that's where we're going to go over your assessment reports and the report that I write for you after all of the assessments have been completed. So giving the client an idea of what this all looks like in the context of the total assessment and what information the client can expect. But also recognize that with an assessment, it is acceptable in some cases, depending on your agency, for an assessment client to turn into a therapy or a counseling client after you've conducted the assessment. So potentially you might have a client who you do a substance use evaluation for, and then they become part of your therapeutic caseload as a therapy client. But the inverse is not ethical. You should not, especially if your agency has rules against this, but typically you should not have a therapy client that you then conduct a substance use assessment with, because this will influence your objectivity with the client during the assessment. If you have more information about the client than what they shared in the intake interview, then this can change the way that you interpret their results and how you write their assessment report. So keep that in mind as you're thinking about clients, that it's okay if an assessment client becomes a therapy client, but a therapy client should not become an assessment client. Also, within the intake interview, sometimes you're going to use some screening assessments that might be necessary depending on the agency. And really, what screening assessments you use will depend on your agency as well as your client. For our experience in this class, I want to talk a little bit about the use of the mini mental status exam, because this can be helpful in substance use assessments to quickly capture any cognitive impairment that your client is experiencing. So mini mental status exams, as we talked about in the first half of our course, are oftentimes used to get that quick assessment of a client's cognitive functioning, and they are deficit focused assessments or screeners where you're looking for any deficits in that area or cognitive impairments. And in substance use assessments, it can be helpful to do a mini mental status exam just to get a good idea of if there are any impairments that are of note for you moving forward in your assessment. So you're going to see an example of this in our practical application of assessments. So we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. But typically, the mini mental status exam that we are using covers orientation to place and time, as well as any registration of the client. Are they able to name objects, point to them, and give identification that they recognize what those are? You're also going to look at the client's attention in their calculations. So are they able to count? Are they able to add? Are they able to spell words backwards? Can they pay attention to that information? You're also going to do a brief assessment of their memory or their recall. Can they remember information that you provided to them previously? Then you're also going to do a quick assessment of their language ability. Are they able to repeat phrases back to you? Are they able to write? Are they able to read and obey commands that are written down? Getting an idea of if they have those skills intact. And typically, if someone has intact skills, you are going to report that information in the demographic, background, or observation section of the report. So saying typically that the client is appeared to be oriented to person, place, and time with no apparent perceptual disturbances, hallucinations, or delusions as an example. This is a typical response that you'll have for a mini mental status exam. Depending on the client, if you have a client who is showing cognitive impairment, that typically opens the door and tells you that you need to do further assessment in that area so that you can get a better idea of whether or not the client should move forward with the substance use assessment or if you need to move forward in a different way. So that's sort of the background of what assessment report writing is and what the intake interview entails. So let's transition a little bit here and talk about the background section of the report, of the assessment report, which is going to be the first writing assignment that you have for this class. So within the background section of the assessment report, you're going to start by watching a mock intake interview that was conducted with a mock assessment client for us. This assessment intake is available to you on Canvas. It's about an hour where you're going to observe an intake interview with an assessment client. While you are watching this assessment intake, you are going to be able to follow along with the interview by filling out the developmental interview template. So this is the agency-specific template for the intake interview that we were using as our mock agency. So it's important for you to follow along and to complete this developmental interview template because you are going to use this information to help write the background assessment section of your assessment report, but you're also going to turn in the completed form with your background section draft. So in other words, when you submit your assignments for week 5, you're going to submit 2 documents. One of them is going to be your draft of the background sections of the assessment report, which we're going to talk about into a little bit more detail, and the other is going to be your completed interview template. So that you followed along with the interview and that you answered all of the questions that were addressed in the intake interview. This is not meant to be an extensive document, this background template. This is meant to be for you to write your assessment report and to get an idea of what writing or what conducting an intake interview looks like. So if your developmental interview template is shorthand and it's incomplete sentences and it's messy, that's okay, as long as you're using it in a way that makes sense to you, because I want this to be an opportunity for you to practice what that developmental interview looks like, what that intake interview looks like. So fill out the developmental interview template as if you were conducting the intake yourself and follow the template that makes the most sense for you. But you're also going to include within the background section some important sections of the assessment report. So primarily, you're going to include the demographic information, specifically that table at the beginning of your assessment report that's at the very top of your paper below your letterhead. You're also going to include a section on the reason for referral. So you're going to type up that section of your assessment report. And then you're going to include the relevant history sections. So the demographic information, substance use history, medical, developmental, psychosocial, educational, occupational, and legal histories. And you're going to see that we use the mini mental status exam as the screener in this intake interview. So you're going to include the results of the mini mental status exam in the demographic information section of that relevant history. So adding that line of whether or not the client is oriented to person, place, and time and has no perceptual disturbances, or if they do. So you're going to include that information in the relevant history demographic information paragraph. So you'll see on Canvas that there is a background, there is a report or a reading for what a mini mental status exam is, why we use them in substance use assessment, and how to score a mini mental status exam. So use that to help inform your scoring of it yourself. Also, within the background section, I want you to keep in mind that there is a sample substance use assessment report that you can use as a template or as an example while you're writing your own assessment report. So there will be a solid example that you can use that will give you an idea of what sort of terminology you need to include, as well as the general structure of an assessment report. But you do still need to write the report by yourself. If you write with some of your friends in the class, naturally you're going to write a report that is too similar to your peers if you write it together. And you don't want to do that. So you need to write your assessment report by yourself so that each of you are submitting a unique document that makes sense in the way that you interpret the assessment. And also make sure that, again, you're submitting both documents for the for week 5. So you're going to submit this background section of your assessment report, and you are going to include that completed developmental interview template that you used while following along with the mock intake session. Both documents are due at 11:59 p.m. on Sunday of week 5. And again, submit both of those documents, but also submit them in Word or Google document forms so that we can give you feedback in the best way possible. Word and Google Docs are the best way for us to give you feedback because we can specifically highlight things and put comments in very specific places in ways that we can't do in PDFs. So make sure that your documents are submitted as Word or Google documents. And finally, also keep in mind that these assessment reports are going to be drafts of the final integrated report that you're going to submit. So each week you're going to submit a draft of a section of the assessment report, and at the end, after you have submitted that report section, we will give you feedback on different ways to further improve the document. And your job will be to implement that feedback for the final assessment report. And even though these are drafts of each section, you're still expected to submit a fully developed and well-written document for each section of your assessment report. We will give you, again, that detailed feedback on how you can further improve your report, and you will earn your grade on each of the drafts of the assessment report based on the effort that you put into the draft and your ability to cover the required components of that section. So, as we mentioned previously, you need to make sure that you include the demographic table, the reason for referral, and all of the relevant history sections. If you include all of those components and you're putting in solid effort into each of these categories, then you're going to get a grade that reflects that. Then your grade on the final assessment report or the final integrated report will be graded on your overall writing quality as well as how well you implemented the feedback that we provided to you. So again, check out Canvas where you're going to see that a little bit more of the written descriptions of this assignment, and you can see the example template of a substance use assessment, and reach out if you have any questions. I will see you all in the next lecture.